Would
Dala,
be very,
very
yes,
interesting perspective that you have with Halak Ben Ali. I'm very
Malek.
interested in Halak, yeah. And I think that the one question that you bring to us is the question of translation between cultures, between different groups, and I would like to hear more about this translation, what it means. Sometimes translation means more than translate one language to another one, but translation means create another language too. And I don't know if Halleck thinking about this kind of new language that appears between these two, this connection that he is making now.
True.
And
Uh-huh.
I think maybe a connected question with Bruno is the role, social role of education, because Paulo Freire works a lot with education. It's the principal action of Paulo Freire. I can say it. I don't know, but how is the perspective of education in Halleck's philosophy? Because I think that is important perspective from my work. For example, how to avoid violence, and sometimes the word education appears a lot. A kind of education against violence to or to make the action in a critical way. Then that's two questions maybe to make a connection that I see between the Bruno and Dala uh,
Mhm.
presentation.
Right. So as for, thank you so much, Silvio, for your interesting questions. As for the question of translating Malik Bennabi's works, I found it really problematic because his early works were in French, the French language, and when you read as a bilingual or a multilingual intellectual, I can read his works in French, in Arabic, and I can translate as an Arab, an Algerian writer or lecturer. But the problem is with the reader, the Western reader. If I mention a word that there was his neologism in Arabic, if I say قابلية للاستعمار, I translate it into French. His word again, his neologism in French, which is colonialisabilité. And I
Mm,
come to the English language and I try to translate the word, and I just find it as colon. This is why I said to Bruno, I found it interesting that he mentioned the word coloniality. It
mhm,
isn't the same word at all. That is, if I explain it, it's hard to find the English word to reach the English or the Anglophone reader. And I say that the individual in the Arab world is able to be colonized or likes to be colonized. It's a bit problematic to find the right
mhm,
word. So it's colonializability and it's a neologism. So as for the works of Malik Bennabi, you can just find very few works translated into English. However, other notions, like I say the word soil, and it's the translation of turab in Arabic, and it doesn't mean really soil as you understand it as an Anglophone
mhm,
receiver of the word. It means something different. It means nation. It means the nation I translated as ummah. So within there is that notion of turab, the soil. So I found it really problematic to translate all of his neologism that he created for a certain context that was the pre-independence context, that is before the independence of Algeria. And then we are trying now to find some equivalent words to uh, to reach the meaning of what he wanted to say back in the 1930s, 1940s. It's not the same
mhm,
notion, and it doesn't refer to the same type of the individual. So the Algerian individual of the 2019, yes, there is that sense of colonializability, in
Mm.
many young people, those who are really social media beings. So I can refer to that love of social media, that love of the other who is Western, but they aren't colonializable as Malik Bennabi referred to in the 1950s before the independence of Algeria, when he wanted to refer to Algerian people who wanted France to stay, who wanted the colonizer to stay in Algeria. So
Mm.
we need to revise all of his works, but
Mm.
still, the notions are still relevant. Right.
Mm. Great.
Is that a cultural understanding?
Yes, a
This is it.
cultural, yes, of this articulation, man, soil, time.
Yeah, of course. This is why I said when you want to understand people coming from the MENA region, you have to go over and through their historical background and cultural background to understand the way they perceive things, and they perceive themselves as well. So there is a cultural understand because for particularly for Bennabi and his contemporaries at that time, the soil is Algeria as their country, their nation. So for him, or for the Islamic civilization, once they lost the Andalus, that is particularly in Spain, they lost soil, one element. So they lost a whole civilization, that is the Islamic civilization. Now, why? To my understanding, why the Islamic civilization or the Arab world is falling into ruin, because the soil is divided. You can't find. Uh, so you got Morocco, the north of Africa, particularly. It's probably one nation, one soil. But with divisions, soil has disappeared. So you have Algeria. Next to Algeria, you have Morocco, and to the east, you have Tunisia. This soil, this bigger soil, in our understanding as Arab people, so it's our property. Once we lose it, we lose our civilization. I think it's been theorized in this way for Benabi. Um, so did I answer your question, Bruno?
Yes, yes.
All right.
Um, so I've got a question for Dalal too. I guess we can keep going that way. Um, um, so I was also wondering about if you would like to articulate maybe a difference between, uh, say, Marx's materialism and Bennabi's objects, persons, and ideas.
The basic one is that Benabi's theorization of subject, and it comes from a religious perspective. So he all the time goes back to Quranic verses to understand the individual, that relationship with the divine. So that's the difference. As for Marx, is really the subject as a subject.
Um, so, Bruno, you mentioned in Freire there was talk about different modes of thought.
What I can say in sort of to explain a little more what I mean by modes of thought is the something that Paulo Freire understands as a form of development of critical consciousness, because he understands that consciousness is something that is intrinsic to human beings, but it is intrinsic to human beings because human beings are in relations with the world. So it is not something, it is not biological, it is not something that human beings have a disposition to uh, develop simply because they are human beings, but because they are beings in the world. In this sense, it is a phenomenological approach, and when he when he when he tries to understand what is critical consciousness, he at first has a more narrow perspective, But in later works, so if you take, for instance, Pedagogy of Autonomy, which is one of his last works, he already is thinking of ethical and aesthetical dimensions of knowledge. So he discusses how knowledge is a construct. It is not discovered, it is built, and it is built in many different ways because the relations that the subjects engage in one another and with the world are different relations. And this is something that I think goes back to his discussion of dialogue. Since how dialogue is such an important concept in Freudian philosophy, he it actually allows, I don't know if it's the best term, but it provokes him to think differently throughout his intellectual trajectory. He starts to think of of knowledge and of epistemic terms, of what is valid knowledge, in 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 more radical ways, which is not to say that everything becomes knowledge necessarily, but that the relation in which we engage in the world and one another is what makes our standpoint politically important when we discuss what modes of thought and knowledge is. So this is, of course, a very anti-positivistic perspective. He actually denounces scientificisms and forms of reification of knowledge in many aspects.
I also Bruno, and what you were talking about at the very end, just mentioning that there's this critical theory is it tends to be using rationality to critique rationality, and that there's the question about what's beyond that critique, and that can open up that in a way. So my interpretation of that was that in a way that leads a person to, so what's beyond this, um, these enlightenment ideas that are just sort of now at this point circling around and criticizing themselves. So you have to just move somewhere else, and that somewhere else, like there's all these different ideas that are in different traditions of thought that would just be natural to look there. um, I in hearing that also, um, I've kind of an Adorno fixation. So in the way that he approaches trying to rescue philosophy in negative dialectics, um, he's he does leave uh, his philosophy open ended, really intentionally, um, and so there are no limits to it. And at the same time, he also um, he specifically advocates um, having an element of a kind of direct experience of knowledge that's outside of just rationalism, but being able to encounter the object of knowledge in a direct way that you get a certain kind of experience, like an aesthetic experience. And so I think that in his, even beyond just rationality criticizing itself, I think that uh, Adorno in his those kind of epistemological related writings points pretty strongly in that direction. Although he doesn't ever say, uh, "Why don't we stop just talking about European philosophers?" um, but I think that it points well in that direction.
What Freire works on with Adorno's thought, I think has something to do with what you are thinking. There is maybe I'm not correct in saying this about Adorno specifically, but there is some interest in his work in writing in essayistic form, the form of essays, right? The ideas of thinking freely in one's own writing. And this is an idea that you see in Paulo Freire, and you see him working throughout many of his books, that there is there are possibilities of thinking a relation with knowledge, an epistemological relation, which do not fall into the categorical uses of notions and concepts as we bring them in our formation. So this is what this is the reason, and this he states explicitly, that the knowledge that people have. So, for instance, when he was working with literacy with adults, illiterate adults in Brazil, he says, no, these people, they have knowledge, what we call popular culture. This is a form of culture which is not systematized. It is a form of culture which is not does not fall into a certain rationality as we know it, but they know something, right? So what do they know? What are their voices about? Their voices are not just subjective voices. They are subjective voices in many ways, and this subjectivity is important. But it is also an objective form of engaging with reality. So this, I think, has some parallel with what you are thinking. Although it is not organized in ways which we identify as a certain rationality, but then he goes as far as to say that there is a rationality in their ways of thinking, which is a rationality that professors, teachers, intellectuals in general are not familiar with. So it is in some way thinking rationality, making a critique of itself, but not in a circular form, but using as a signifier the term rationality to think of what rationality has left out. I don't know if it is the best strategy, but it is a strategy that Freire adopts, and I think it has some maybe dialogues with what you were thinking.
Yeah, that does sound like it has quite a bit in common. And the idea about rationality, I have to admit, with Adorno, I still can't quite grasp exactly what this means, but that using rationality to kind of to create an experience of the object that's outside of rationality, but it's sort of like creating a kind of negative reflection of it somehow, and allowing it to sit there without specifically trying to define it. Um, I can't entirely wrap my head around that, but I think that did
Difficult.
sound, yeah. um, his philosophy seems to me um, to be open-ended enough that it may be possible to dialogue with ideas that are even sort of radically outside of the Enlightenment tradition. I think it allows space for that.
I wanted to refer to transmodernity as you were talking about that. I started reading about the philosophy of or the movement of modernity by Enrique Dussel, and I just wanted to ask both, maybe Bruno or Silvio, to tell us more about this philosophy or this movement and how it reflects what is happening in the southern part of the globe. I mean, since they come from Latin America, and Enrique Dussel has theorized about Latin America through this movement.
I don't know very well Dussel. He is close to us, but he's not so much studied like he's, I think, should be studied here in Brazil. But sometimes there are many relations between Dussel and the kind of dialects that Paulo Freire creates in many ways. Mainly the question of liberation that Dussel
Yeah.
and the Freire uh, arise their thoughts. And I don't know, there is a lot of questions that I made when I read or heard about Dussel. That's a kind of a danger question in his thought. Maybe sometimes Dussel sounds like a very ontological perspective of America, like an anti-European thinking, and not a
Oh, I
relation
see.
between Europe and America. That's a question that I put to myself, but I don't know him very well. Maybe Paulo Freire can escape from this danger, because he, like Bruno said, Paulo Freire has this question of rationalization inside the rationalization, and it's a constructive way to decolonize thoughts that Paulo Freire has. But I don't know, because of this context of Dussel is very different from the context of Paulo Freire. For example, in Mexico, when you are in Mexico, you can see every time the native culture in the city of Mexico. In Brazil, for example, the indigenous people is hiding. Unfortunately, it's in the forest, and not there are no monuments of the indigenous
Interesting.
people inside of the metropolis in Brazil, for example. And maybe this connection between the native culture that Dussel has in Mexico makes him to think more about a specific ontological way of Mexican, of Americans thinking, that is very interesting, that appears in very interesting moments. And maybe sometimes Paulo Freire is it is not so hard, so strong in the Paulo Freire. I don't know if Bruno agree with me, but sometimes, but he is trying to see this popular culture appearing in their people. For example, in the illiteracy adults that Bruno mentioned in the answer. Then there is some different aspects, but there is the same movement to reconstruct a perspective of the periphery, or a perspective from the Americas in Dussel and Freire, but they assumed different strategies because the historical materials or the geopolitical materials that they have are different. Then that's some aspects that I am trying to think about, how the strategies are different sometimes, and maybe that is this connection and this difference between them.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would say sort of also on the lines of what Silvio just mentioned, that I think what a difference in what Freire works with and Dussel, despite the relationship between their their thinking, which there are many relations that you can trace between what Dussel says and what Paulo Freire says. There's a lot of interesting points in common, sort of, with, of course, with certain differences, but that you can try to think together. But there is something that I don't see as much in Dussel's thinking, and of course I studied some of Dussel in my work, not as much as Paulo Freire, but I mean, I think I can say this, that there is a different vision on humanism. Freire
Mm.
is a humanist. He is fundamentally a humanist. Silvio, I think, can recall how much in Brazil he is accused of because he's a Christian, and because he's a Christian, he would be a less intellectually precise thinker. But what I think is actually in place here, and maybe this has some relation with Malek's thinking, is the, I don't know, maybe the role of the human, because this aspect of his thinking with some influence of Christianity in his work actually becomes an influence of humanism. So humanism is very strong, and in Dussel I don't see as much this strength. Although I can say that in Dussel's work there is an aspect of I think a strong influence of Western rationality in Dussel's work, because Dussel, in some way, he's an Argentine philosopher. He states to this day that he is in exile in Mexico because he actually did exile the Argentine dictatorship, but he still puts it in these terms, interestingly, and he does develop a sort of thinking that in the Americas there is, because of colonization, an anti-capitalistic way of thought which is proper to this reality. And in this sense, I think he, in some ways, essentializes this this domain. So I'm not sure if he does that because he he wishes to deliberately think of in ontology, as Silvio said, proper of our reality and our people here in the Americas, or if he does so because of the Western influence in his own thought. Because one thing, for example, here in Brazil, we have a group that discusses philosophy of liberation, and I am in some ways related to this group. And there has been discussions there in which people have actually told Enrique Dussel that they of their of their discordance to some aspect of his philosophy. For instance, the idea that he is building a system of thought, and he has this. He states this publicly, that he is building a system of thought. You have his ontological aspects developed in some works. Then now the recent ethical aspects and ethics of liberation, and he's still to write the last work on logic. So in some ways he wants to actualize this idea of a system of thought, and this is very Western. So in this sense, I think when he discusses, for instance, modernity, which you point, right, he has
Yeah.
an understanding that modernity was made possible because of colonization, and this I agree with him totally. I think that modernity is a project made possible through colonization. Without colonization, capitalism would not be possible, modernity would not be possible as a project in itself. But when he does that, he's not saying this in a way only just to think that, well, so we should abandon entirely the modern project itself. But at the same time, he does not make clear that the what does the modern project still have to contribute to philosophy of liberation. It lies in between. You don't under, at least I'm sorry, I don't understand, of course, in my reading, where exactly does he say of the contribution of this project. So in some ways it can be used to say that we don't have anything to do with rationality in terms of Western thinking, and then we must do our own philosophies from our references of the marginalized. But it also sounds very strange to me, because it's almost as if he was the one which would make the bridge between these realities, and while still advocating that the others do not engage in this modern way of thinking. So I think it does have some limitations there.